Hey everybody, it's Pravus. We're gonna do something completely different for the channel today. Something that has nothing to do with playing a game, except for maybe the lead up to this video. Last week I played a demo of a game called 100 Days, which is a winemaking simulator, and I played it mostly because I had a chance to talk a bit about wine being one of my personal passions, something I'm really enthusiastic about, and just kind of sharing it with you guys. And there were some really good positive responses out of that. Some people suggesting they'd like to hear me talk a bit more about this stuff, and I thought, you know, why not? Let's do something completely atypical for the channel and actually just talk a bit more about wine. So what I've elected to do is a wine tasting. I am going to go through 4 different wines, and I'm just going to simply taste them, talk a bit about the individual wines, where they are from, some of what I've learned along the way, and just have a little bit of fun with it. So sit back and chill, because this is not your typical Pravus video. Now, if you ever go to a winery for a wine tasting, if they have any idea what they're doing, the first thing they're going to do is start you off with the white wines. You don't want to have reds and then whites, because the reds are a bit drier, and it's going to throw off your flavor palette and make the whites come across as way sweeter than intended. So you always start with a white wine. And to that extent, what I have here is a Robert Mondavi Private Selection Chardonnay, grown in Monterey County as of 2018. This one has been aged in bourbon barrels, so I'm expecting a fun little flavor profile here. Chardonnay, very classic white wine, usually known for being a little bit buttery in its flavor, depending on how it has been prepared. Usually goes very well with fish. Now, what we've got here is a very, very nice golden color. Doesn't usually tell you too much just looking at the coloring of the wine. Sometimes it gives you a hint as to how much body that wine is going to have. Now, right now, you see that I'm just swishing this thing around, and this may seem like a very pretentious thing that the stereotypical hoity-toity wine drinker is going to do, right? It's like, oh, look at me, I have wine, I must be so fancy. No, the reason you do this is because the more surface area you have exposed, the more aroma can be released from the wine when you smell it. And of course, smelling a wine is absolutely crucial. So much of our taste comes from just being able to smell whatever we're about to eat or drink. Wine being no exception, so you spend a lot of time really working on that aroma. That's considered half the fun. And then you're going to give it a good taste. Now, you don't just sniff and think that that's going to get you some good scent. Not much at all. What you really do is shove your nose right on in there and go as deep as you can get. That actually smells very, very good. I would say that I smell a little bit of... probably a little bit of lemon. Definitely some fruit flavors going on here. It's pretty mild. There's actually a bit of an, almost a citric acid sort of scent to it. I think that's why I'm thinking a little bit of lemons. It smells like it's got a little bit of a sourness to it here. Maybe a little bit of cat pee. I know that sounds kind of nasty, but that's maybe another explanation for some of the sour taste. It actually could be a little bit more of an ammonia scent, and that's kind of what's triggering up in my brain. And now that I have this pretty deeply inside of my nose, I'm going to go ahead and give it a little taste. That's pretty nice. Not very buttery. Again, some Chardonnays kind of taste a little bit like melted butter. Not as much of that. This one does have a little bit more of a sour tartness to it, so it's probably a little bit higher in the acidity on this one. Not very sweet. I'd say kind of halfway between like a very sweet wine and a very dry wine. Dry being the opposite of sweet, if you are not familiar with that. This one is quite pleasant. Now, I'm curious as to what they think I ought to be tasting in this. I was expecting the bourbon barrels to come forward a little bit more, and that's not quite what happened there. Caramel. Okay, yeah, I could see a little bit of caramel. They say that vanilla is a thing. Not really detecting much in the way of vanilla. They're also suggesting pineapple and peach. Peach, apricot, I can kind of see that. Pineapple is very much a catch-all descriptor for a lot of wines, I think. Whenever it has a little bit of acidity, a lot of people will take the sweetness and the tartness and just assume pineapple. I could kind of see that. It's not too bad there. I think I'm mostly detecting what I would consider more of an apricot. And yeah, a little bit of a caramel flavor to it. Not much in the way of tannins, not much in the way of the smokiness I would expect from oak. Overall, quite nice. Now, what a lot of people will do if you go to a winery is they'll provide you a bucket, because some people don't actually drink the wine whenever they give it a good taste. Instead, they let it sit in their mouth for a little bit, and they just give it a good spit into a bucket. You know, just the big community spit bucket. I personally find that a little gross. I like to actually drink my wine, but you know, if you're planning on tasting, let's say, 20 wines, and you can afford to do things like that, well then yeah, you may not want to get a little tipsy before you finish the batch, right? Okay, so we're gonna move on to another white wine. Now this one is actually imported from Spain. Spain is very much an up-and-comer in the wine industry right now. I'm starting to see a lot more Spanish wines being imported into the United States. Of course, certain regions like France and Italy, very well entrenched. The Rhine region in Germany also being up there. But Spain and Portugal have pretty good climates for growing some wine, especially in the more highland regions of Spain. So I'm not surprised to see that it is starting to make a bit of a comeback in the United States. Now this one looks very much the same as a Chardonnay. Not much difference really in terms of the coloring and such. Very different scent though. Okay, hang on. This one's... I've never had this one. Actually, hang on. I'm sorry. This is from the region of Spain. What kind is it? This is an Albariño. Never had an Albariño before. This is actually a new varietal for me, which is always exciting. But I want to give this a shot. Okay, so this one actually doesn't have as much of a sour flavor, or scent to it, I should say. There's definitely more of a floweriness to it. Like if I go into a field of honeysuckle flowers, there's a lot more of that going on there. But there is something a little bit tart. I would actually say that there's something almost a little herbal about it. Maybe lemongrass? Not like just the lemon fruit, but like actual lemongrass, if you've ever just smelled that herb. There's kind of something about that going on here as well. Maybe a little bit of minerals, like from mineral water, that kind of a thing. Not the flavor I was expecting, though, based on that, based on the aroma I was getting. Oh, wow, that's very different. Okay. There's definitely a strong mineral flavor to this one in particular. Almost as if you just mix some mineral water into some wine. There's something like that going on there. A little bit of vanilla, a little bit of honey, and then just lemon juice. Here's what's really hitting me here, though, surprisingly. So when you first taste a wine, the opening flavors, as it kind of moves up your palate and stuff, tend to be very dominant. But afterwards, there's something we call the finish. But it's basically the aftertaste as you swallow the wine. It moves toward the back of your palate, and it kind of lingers in there. That's considered to be the finish. And there's usually a bit of a different flavor going on here. This one, surprisingly, is almost medicinal in its finish. Like, it's not too bad in its leading flavors. A little different, but not bad. But yeah, finishing it off, there's something almost like a very weak cough syrup in the very back. That's unusual. To me, it's not the most balanced. I think I just really am not a big fan of that medicinal flavor in the back. Definitely interesting, though. Definitely interesting. Now, one of the reasons I was saying that I think that Spain could be a very good winemaking region, especially with the highlands going on there, has a lot to do with the vines themselves. You would think that a good vine to make grapes for wine would be best off in a lush, well-watered, lots of sun, nutrient-rich soil, right? But no, that's actually not usually the case. What I find, as I studied most of these vines, is that you usually want to have kind of less hospitable terrain for your vines. The harder they have to work, the better the grapes usually end up being, weirdly enough. So you usually want somewhat harsh terrain, enough sun and enough water to make sure that it's able to get plenty of sugars in those grapes, lots of flavor. But too much, make it too easy, and you get weak grapes, which make weak wine. Weird, right? That's kind of how it works. As far as some other wines, though, let's move on to the reds. Now, I'm personally a bit of a red person myself. I really enjoy red wines the most. They tend to be the most complex in their flavor. They're not as sweet, and I don't like sweet wines quite as much. A bit of more tannin going in there, a lot more body, sometimes a bit more fruit forward, depending a lot on what you get. So what I've got here is a wine called the Seven Deadly Zins. Now, I've had this one before, and this is one that you can get at a lot of supermarkets. It's not, just because it's mass-produced and shipped all over the country does not mean that it is cheap by any stretch. But this is a red Zinfandel, 2016, which of course means it is almost certainly from the California region. Yep, this is going from Grayton, California. Yeah, California wine, red Zinfandel, they go hand in hand, absolutely. That is pretty much the wine I would say that is quintessentially American, is a good red Zinfandel. Now, there are white Zinfandels. I highly encourage you never to drink them. They are not something I very much take seriously at all. I find them just kind of terrible. They're honestly not even very white. They're more of a rosé in the way that they end up turning out. But I don't like them. I do not like a white Zinfandel, and most wine aficionados that I know would also agree that white Zinfandel is just not something you take seriously. Kind of like Moscato, which is like a bubbly wine. Cheap, appeals to somebody who has no real taste for wine itself, very easily consumed en masse. Kind of like kind of like if you say that you really like beer, but all you drink is Miller Lite. You know, it's kind of taken in that same sort of way. Again, that makes me sound a little elitist, I know. But I mean, that's how it is. Now, a red Zinfandel. Oh, this stuff's usually really good. And if this is anything like the other red Zins that I've had from the Seven Deadly Zins, then this is going to be really good. Very different scent here. This one actually has a little bit more of a leading scent of raisins. Now, raisin scent and flavor is actually very typical of port wine, which is far more distilled than your average wine. It's a lot heavier, but it usually has a very, very strong raisin flavor. I don't expect this to actually taste like raisins at all. There's a little bit of a tobacco scent to this one, which is not what I also typically would get out of a red Zin, so I think I might be a little bit off calibration right now. But it's not bad. Maybe a little bit of kind of a dark fruits. I'm thinking like black cherries, or perhaps even a little bit of plum. And maybe just a hint of vanilla. Just a hint of vanilla is what I'm detecting. That's the sort of stuff that's just triggering in my brain right now. Whether I'm right or not, again, it's kind of up to everyone individually. Let's give this one a taste. Oh, that's good. So, red wine, if you are not familiar, when you harvest a grape, usually you can make either a white or a red wine out of it. For example, Pinot Noir and Pinot Grigio, I believe, are both from the same type of grape, but obviously one ends up being a white wine and one ends up being a red wine. The white wine is when you extract out just the juices and then ferment that into a white wine. The red wine ferments with what I call the cap. Actually, I think that's the proper industrial term. But that is all of the grape skins, sometimes some of the other debris from the vines, such as some of the twigs and the leaves, etc., all kind of stewed into that very hot fermenting tank with the wine. And that's where it gets its color. But it's also where it gets a lot of the tannin, which is kind of a texture, almost a woody texture that can linger in your mouth. You can also get a little bit more tannin if it ages in a barrel, such as American or French oak barrels can leave behind a little bit of that fibrous tannin in it. It's not very strong. When I say fibrous, don't think that it actually feels like there are fibers floating in the wine. It just changes how it works in your mouth. And a little bit of tannin can help balance out the wine pretty well. So you would not be surprised then that red wines typically have a lot more tannin than a white wine because they fermented with the cap. No exception here. I'm definitely getting a lot more tannin. Yeah, and also way more body in this particular wine, and that's not unusual for a red wine. They usually are older. They've usually had a lot longer to ferment and kind of stew in their own flavor profile, so they usually end up being a lot stronger in body. Now, because this is a American wine, it is a New World version of a wine. I'm not surprised that this Zin has a lot more fruit-forward flavors. If you have Old World wines, which usually come from, the classic regions in Europe, in particular France and Italy, you'll usually have very complex flavors ranging from leather and ash and clay, etc., etc. That's not at all unusual, but again, the New World wines tend to have a lot more fruit-dominant flavors. So in this one, I'm definitely getting a lot more fruit. Plum, I think, is a pretty reasonable descriptor for some of it. Plum is usually something I get out of a Merlot, so I wouldn't say that this is quite it, though. There's more to it than that. There's a slight minerality to this. I would say that it does have a little bit of flavor of clay, but it's very light. It's a very, very light flavor. There's almost a wood flavor, like if I got some cedar, right, and licked a cedar block, there's a little bit of that flavor going on in here as well. But mostly it's going to be fruit, and I don't think it's entirely plum. There's probably also a little bit of cherry, maybe red currant, which is not something you usually get to have much of in the United States, but I understand in Europe it's a far more prevalent thing that you can find in candies and other such snacks, etc., so you can taste that a little bit more often. I have tasted red currant, and it's pretty good, and I would say that this actually has a bit of that flavor going on as well. And yeah, I stick by a little bit of a hint of vanilla as I was smelling. Very good wine. I like this one a lot. Now, I think a lot of people assume, in the world of wine, that if you have a very expensive wine, that usually is a mark of good quality. Not often the case, I have found. This one, the Seven Deadly Zins, this one costs, I think, somewhere on the order of $16 per bottle, which is not too bad for a red wine at all. You can have wines that go up far beyond that. I've had some that cost as much as $200 per bottle before. I was at a very fancy restaurant. It's not something I would normally get. And it is often quite good, but not quite worth that price point. You might be talking like a 4 or 5% kind of an improvement in the wine for more than, 6 or so times the price, right? So don't think that just because a wine is found kind of in the middle of the shelf, that means it's a bad wine. If you get a very cheap wine, yeah, you usually can tell that. Like, if you get a $5 bottle of wine, it's gonna taste like it's a $5 bottle of wine, probably. But just because it costs significantly more than a more middle-of-the-road, $12 to $20 bottle of wine does not mean it's going to necessarily be much better. In fact, I have often enjoyed the more middle-of-the-road wines a lot more than the hoity-toity expensive ones. That's not unusual at all. Now, usually, those wines get expensive in part because they are imported, and that actually brings me into my fourth and final wine here. This is a Pinot Noir, imported from France. This one was made in the Burgundy region of France, and of course France is, they pride themselves on being masters of wine, and I think it's a well-deserved title for France. French wines usually end up being pretty complex and very well known for a good reason. They also have a lot of famous wines that literally can only be made in France. For example, a Bordeaux. A Bordeaux is actually a blend of several different grapes that are made together, and legally speaking, Bordeaux can only come from the Bordeaux region in France. Anything that is similar, the same types of grapes, same mix ratios, etc., made anywhere else can only legally call itself a Bordeaux style of wine, but it is only a Bordeaux if it comes from the Bordeaux region of France. Very good, by the way. Mixed wines actually used to be far more prevalent. It's actually a very recent thing in the world of wine, I think in the last few decades or so, that you're finding a lot more winemakers are making just a single type of grape into a wine. We call them varietal wines. It's one variety of a grape. But blends used to be the prevalent ones. You kind of would take whatever was available in the region and blend them into some good wines, and that's how things like Bordeaux and such got going historically in France. Nowadays, you just have a single grapes, but I do like a good blend. They usually end up being a lot more complex and less predictable, though, because I can usually tell you what kind of flavors I will expect out of a Merlot or a Cabernet Sauvignon or a Syrah. But a blend, it's kind of dealer's choice. It's whatever the winemaker wants it to be, but you can get really good stuff as it take the strengths that complement each other from different wines and mix them together. Either way, though, so with this Pinot Noir, let's take a good smell. Not as deep as I was expecting. Now, this one has a bit of a smell of earth to it, and I mean like actual soil and dirt. That's a bit more what I would expect, I think, out of a European style of wine. There is, again, more of an earthiness to it, or the terroir, as we will call it. The terroir being a wine descriptor for the earth that this stuff grows in. And this type of soil that a vine grows in makes a huge difference in the flavor profile. The combination of the pH balance of the soil, whether it is particularly strong in clay or sand, etc., that changes a lot of stuff. In fact, some of the best wine tasters in the world who get certified as sommeliers, they can actually smell and taste a wine and tell you exactly what region of the world it is in based on the flavor and guessing from what they know about the soil. And you have to be able to pinpoint that stuff with absurd levels of accuracy, even to be certified as a sommelier. It's a very, very lucrative job, but it's extremely difficult to get into. It's almost something only savants can do. Now, there's also, as on top of the soil smell that I'm getting here, there's also a bit of a woodiness to it. I would say a bit of an oak. Kind of if I were just sitting up in a tree somewhere as a kid, that kind of smell you get from like from the bark and the sap. There's a little bit of something like that going on in here as well. A little bit of fruit-forward flavors or scents here as well. I would say, kind of going back to the red currant there, I think the smell of red currant is very strong there. Maybe even a little bit of strawberry. I'd say a little bit of strawberry in here. There's something else, but I can't quite put my finger on it, so I'm going to just let that come to me later. Let's go ahead and give it a good taste. Oh, this one's way more complex. Nowhere near as fruit-forward as the Zinfandel, which is, again, what I would have expected. This one actually leads with a bit of a punch of tannins. It feels like it's got a very thick body to it when you first taste it, though it actually surprisingly dissipates pretty quickly as it sits in your mouth. That doesn't linger for too long. But I can tell, just by like the feel of my tongue, how it feels like it's kind of been coated a little bit. That's the tannins at work there. So I know that this has a pretty high tannin content in the wine. It just doesn't linger very long. In fact, actually, I'd say that the finish on this one's a little bit weak. Like, it doesn't have much of an aftertaste at all, aside from the feeling of the tannin left behind in your mouth. I'm not detecting a whole lot of fruit. Like, the smell of strawberries and stuff, very deceptive. There's no flavor of berries in this one really at all. I would say that there is very much a red currant flavor to it. I would say that there's also, strangely enough, a bit of a flavor of dust. That doesn't sound pleasant, I know, but it's quite fine. It's perfectly fine. But there is almost a little bit of if I just kind of walked into a super dusty room, or if I smashed a pillow that was covered in dust, it got into the air and I kind of inhaled it. There's almost a little bit of that sort of flavor to it, bizarrely enough. I would definitely say that there's a lot of clay / minerality in this one as well. Definitely an earthiness to it. This one's definitely hard. This is definitely a hard wine to get a good read on. Does it give you any descriptions? So it's aged in French oak, which is not unexpected given that this was made in France. They actually think that there's a lot more fruit flavors in this one. They're describing it with plums, raspberries, and cherries. I guess I could see a little bit of the raspberry, but the plum and cherry I would say not nearly as much. And that may be because I had the red Zinfandel before this, and in contrast, the Zinfandel feels like it has a lot more fruit flavors in this. They actually would recommend this going with roasted chicken, pork, or grilled fish. I don't think I would agree with the fish, but pork or chicken, yes, I could see that working pretty well here. Now, one of the things that's fun about an old world wine, I would say that they almost always have to be paired with food if you want to really enjoy them. And that's one of the things that's really fun about wine. If you really want to make your wine tasting experience go to the next level, you eat it with food. They complement each other so very well, depending a lot on what you get. So as earlier I was saying, the Chardonnay goes very well with something like fish, and that's because the buttery flavors of that and the acidity tends to work well with fish. But some wines, such as a Pinot Noir, oftentimes go well with pork. Some more fruit-forward ones can go well with beef, for example, a Merlot, or actually a Syrah, or a Shiraz as it's also called, which is a little bit peppery in its flavor, goes very, very well with, let's say, a steak. And you put those things together, and I often find that the wine can enhance the flavor of the food, and the flavor enhances the wine. Both complement each other very well. If you get a good food pairing with a wine, you're in heaven. It's absolutely amazing. I love doing that. This one is good. I don't think I have a lot more to say about it, though, because, again, I think I need to unpack it a bit more. And I'm kind of already out of time on this video. We're 30 minutes in. Good lord. I feel like I've only been doing this for like 10 minutes. Man, this is what happens when you have fun. I really love wine. I really, really do. I drink this stuff pretty much whenever I get the chance, within moderation. Wine is something you don't want to drink a lot of, I find. It's usually something you want to have 1, maybe 2 glasses, and just chill. Let it kind of ride, and it is such a fun experience. And every wine is different because of the way that it is made. Every winemaker has the freedom to change the profile a little bit, so you never know what you're really going to get. Even if you're familiar with the grape, the winemaker might totally surprise you. And it's a fun experience and a surprise every time around, so I really like this. I know this is a very different video for me to do, and I hope that you guys are okay with that, but I have fun with this, and I just kind of wanted to share some of my passion with you guys today. We'll resume a lot of my regular gaming content as of next week. This is not a regular thing we're going to do here. It's just something I felt like I wanted to do, just as a one-off little experience. I had fun with this. Hopefully you guys got a little bit of something out of this as well. Thank you all very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed. If so, then I would ask that you hit that like button, leave a comment, and subscribe. And I will see you guys next time.